Hello and welcome to Verum Fabula Fellowship Podcast. I'm Wes Mullins.
And I'm Randy Hardman, and we will be your hosts today. It is our goal to bring you content that cultivates and enriches your daily interactions and encourages the refinement of character and intellect. The terrain we cover ranges from literature to philosophy to theology. It is our hope that through these lenses we can offer insight to the human experience and the human condition that is empowering and transformative.
Verum Fabula Fellowship is located in the beautiful town of Wilmore, Kentucky, and the podcast takes place at Drinkling's Roastery on Main Street. This is also where the fellowship meets regularly and where members are encouraged to present new thoughts and ideas, engage with interesting and important topics in discussion seminars, and interact with and listen to keynote speakers invited in to challenge us intellectually and spiritually. It is a true intellectual collective. Please rate this podcast on iTunes, and if we've said things that are helpful, be sure to tell your Lewis and Tolkien friends about us. With no more ado, here we go. Further up and further in. Hello, everybody. Got a great group tonight. Look at this. This is awesome. We're inside. Nobody's dying. Heat stroke.
No train intermissions.
I know. The last few times we've been outside, it's been killer. I'm not sure why we were having them outside, but it was. Randy was like, "Let's go outside." Okay, all right, we'll do that. Anyway, thank you guys for coming out so much. This is awesome. There's my good buddy Chris. Come on in, buddy. So tonight, I hate to tell you, is the last night of our soft open. So we will not be doing this again until the end of August, 1st of September. Not sure exactly what date it is because we get back on the 22nd after almost 5 weeks in Norway, hiking around mountains and fjords and being, just doing
rough
nothing. The rough life. Eating seafood and all that good stuff. So we'll have you guys, I'll keep you on update on emails. I think Randy and I are going to do we'll do some podcasts from over there, so there'll still be some stuff on. You guys don't know, we have a podcast. It is Verum Fabula Fellowship Review. It's on iTunes, on Google. It's on literally everywhere you can get podcasts. It's there. So check us out. Leave us a 5-star review only, please. Anything less, don't leave it. No. And so we'll also be starting an Instagram account. So when this thing starts back up, we'll be in full swing with social media and more things. And we're even talking with someone right now about having our first local chapter, another chapter. Doing that because the goal would be, this person's like, I would like to do C.S. Lewis and cosmology, and I thought, wouldn't that be amazing if we had somebody somewhere doing C.S. Lewis and cosmology, somebody doing Tolkien and something like all these different connected, but they're all very fabulous stuff, and we all have access to all that information, and then we have it going to a website that's feeding all this content. That would be a ton of content for us as Verum Fabulites. To consume it, it'd be very good. So I'm excited about that prospect. So we'll see where that goes. It may take a while to organically kind of pop up. But also, just know, if some of you are like, hey, Wilmore's kind of a far drive, I'd like to do this in Lexington. That'd be awesome. We'd help you guys do that as well up there. And so you can start that group in that community up there. But we love having everyone down here. And you guys have made this awesome, I'm going to tell you. When we got started 2 months ago, we had no idea there'd be this many people interested. We hoped there'd be this many people, and plus the level of intelligence here, guys, is awesome. I feel like we're just sitting in this massive room of just so much potential. It's amazing. So last meeting tonight. Will be some meetings in September. So be working on some stuff. I really hope that you guys will want to start presenting some of your ideas, even if it's only, I just have an idea. I have an inkling, I don't know. But I just have a thought. I want to present it to you guys. And then, because what usually happens is somebody says, well, I have this thought. And then 3 or 4 people get around and suddenly you turn it into an actual idea. And then it's got a concept. And then you're like, oh man, we can do something with this. So that's what I hope happens. I know I was talking to David about some stuff, and I was like, we should collaborate on this on climate change and the church. And I was like, oh man, there's all kinds of stuff we could pull as a society. We could pull together and help with different inputs, because we all have different vantage points and perspectives, and it'd be nice for us to put our academia to use into projects like this and stuff. So I'm excited. Iron sharpens iron, right? And that's what this is all about, us being an intellectual collective and us learning up from each other. So my hope is that each of you will step up. I don't mean to be like in a shaming way, but like step into and go, hey, here's an idea that I have. I don't know if I have anything or not, but here it is. I mean, so when I went to Oxford and I was, the first time Michael Ward said, hey, you want to go grab a pint at Eagle and Child? I'm like, almost passing out. He's like, oh my gosh. Michael Ward just asked me to Eagle and Child. Here we go. And he says, so, well, what are you doing? And I spent an hour giving him my thesis. And he didn't think it was horrible. He didn't think it was horrible. He actually said, oh, read this book, read that book. I think you might have something. It was an awesome thing for someone to give that kind of validation. So we'd like to hear your ideas and go, yeah, how can we help facilitate it? How can we help pull that out? Because each of us need what each other has. There's something inside of us that everybody else needs, and so we need to pull that together and sharpen each other. Randy and I really thank you guys again for coming out here and making this what it is. It's been fantastic. From Nick starting that discussion that went for like 3 hours, and just in the sweltering heat, and it was just so good. That is a private podcast. I didn't make that public because let's take a vote right now on something. I just want to get your consensus. If we do discussion seminars, would you want it to be recorded or not for public consumption, or just for private consumption?
No opinions either way. Yeah.
The reason being, some people might be less likely to want to give their opinion if they think people are going to listen to it. And I just didn't want to throw someone out there.
I think it would be nice if it was edited. Somebody went through and edited it so that it was very concise. Like, I'm saying that I don't care if my comments are
Right.
or not, but like the comments that seemed important to the editor
Right.
were put in so that it seemed like it flowed well. Definitely.
Yeah. I probably won't do that right now, but that is a good idea. That because there could be some stuff in there that's just, I left it organic just because for posterity's sake. This is what happened. This is how it went down. It is 3 hours. Unless you listen to Joe Rogan, I don't know if you're going to listen to 3 hours or not.
Sure.
Podcast. But if no one has an objection to that, we can just take it off that and put it on to, because it is ready to go. But I sent it to private because I wanted to make sure with you guys before we did that. So everything that will be recorded in the meetings will then go
I like
public.
the less about even if it wasn't the whole thing, just being able to kind of sit down. I've been wanting to get with you guys to chat about it after, at some point, but just to sit down and kind of talk about the key insights that came from it. Maybe just pull some of the things you kind of felt like the group was like, hey, this is what we kind of all talked about. We all sort of kind of had these kind of seemed like the main insights that everyone had to contribute. And
Well, that's what we're doing. If someone, besides myself, would want to say, hey, on discussion seminars, I'll take some notes, and this key idea came up,
yeah.
that'd be fantastic, because I did that for what you did, and so I pulled these threads together. Because what we will be doing is we'll have, like tonight, before you guys came, I had a pre-interview with Derek. He's going to be the keynote speaker. So we'll have a pre-interview, so you get the introduction. So there'll be a podcast for pre-introduction. Then there will be the actual talk. Like this will all be a podcast, and then there'll be the debriefing. Will also be a podcast. For discussion seminar, there'll be a discussion seminar, and then there'll be a debriefing with the person leading the seminar. So if there are seminars that you guys are like, I don't want to present an idea, but I want to present a topic that we can talk about. That would be awesome. So you guys be thinking about a topic, something you guys want to hit together. And if you do a discussion seminar, we ask for 10 to 15 minutes of content, a couple of possible key questions to get us started, and that's all. And then we'll take over from there. So, but if you do a discussion seminar, we will want to do a debrief podcast with you. Yeah.
Yeah. So I wasn't even here for the other discussion seminar, so I have no dog in that fight. I think I would, just my personal opinion, prefer to kind of take it on a case by case, whether we make it public or private.
Okay.
And maybe go for a default of private.
Yes.
And if you feel like, hey, I throw it really good, throw it out there, you guys want to make this public. That kind of protects the like, hey, you can process out loud. If you want to say something that sounds kind of off the wall, feel free to do it. And if we find afterwards, like, we thought this was a great conversation, you know, would you mind this going public? That's my inclination. Obviously, I'm not in charge of groups, so, you know, whatever.
I think that's a good idea. Everybody agree?
Yeah, I
we think
so.
that's good. It's default is
Yeah.
private, and then if we listen to it and think that it's good, yeah.
Yeah.
Now the good thing is no one knows anyone's names.
Sure.
And it's just, we don't go around and say, I'm this person, you know. So no one says, yes, you know, Derek, you want to say something. It's more organic. So it would only be you getting embarrassed if you know what you speak.
Yeah, that's fair. No, that's fair.
But keeping it private, and then just so after we have a discussion seminar, we'll come back to the next meeting and say, hey, do you guys want to release that or not? And we'll just make that a motion that we make. If you don't want to release it, it could be a sensitive topic, and you don't want to release it, we'll keep it private. But it will be on there for history and posterity's sake. All right. Yes. Okay. All right.
Do you want me to cut recording before the discussion on that note with this, or keep it
On Q&A?
Yeah.
I'd rather you keep it going on Q&A.
Okay, sure.
Because I think that's where a lot of the meat can come from too. And if it's Q&A, you know you're asking a specific question, and so I think that's
cool.
I think that's fair. That's because you're not coming with something off the wall, I don't think. But, all right, so with that said, I hate to do this, guys, but I'm going to bid you adieu because I have a 4:00 flight in the morning to Utah, and I still have a lot of stuff to do when I get to the house. And because we're packing for 2 trips, we're also going to Norway, so we don't come home. We come home at midnight and leave the very next morning to go on our next trip. So we got to have everything packed and ready to go. So when we land, we come home, sleep, grab our bags, and we're out again. So, but I mean, I know you guys are. I've been going to Norway, so it's not like I'm having a hard life or anything.
For the sake of, I'm going to slide down this way.
Yeah.
Fill it out.
Come on in. All right,
I just hate
guys.
sitting by Evan.
Come on over.
Derek.
Papa.
Oh wait, and I will now introduce PhD candidate from the University of St. Andrews, or St. Andrews University. Which one? University of St. Andrews. Derek King.
Great. I've got these little handouts for you all to sort of follow along. There's not much on there comparatively, but it'll give you something to look at as I go along here. So just a little introduction to what I'm going to do. I am going to partially read this paper, partially just sort of present. I am going to probably turn this paper in for a publication in the Journal of Inklings Study, which is published at the University of Edinburgh, but I would like some feedback and criticisms first from you all. So please feel free to rip it to shreds as much as you see fit. My topic, my dissertation topic at St. Andrews is divine hiddenness, and particularly divine hiddenness in a philosopher called J.L. Schellenberg. And I'll get more into his argument as in the paper. And so when Wes texted me a couple weeks ago and asked if I wanted to do this and talk about hiddenness, and I had just finished reading Lewis's Till We Have Faces. And so I immediately knew, I was like, definitely talking about Till We Have Faces. One of my favorite Lewis works. Just out of curiosity, how many people have read Till We Have Faces?
Till We Have Faces?
One. Okay.
On my shelf.
There are going to be some spoilers, but I'm keeping the spoilers to a minimum. And I don't think any amount of spoilers could actually spoil the experience for you. I think you all will really enjoy it. It's a great book. It's one of my favorites from Lewis. But that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about how this problem of divine hiddenness, particularly as it shows up in the philosophy of religion literature, with this philosopher J.L. Schellenberg, how some corresponds to some of what Lewis does in Till We Have Faces, both how he sets up the problem and then a few responses to it. And so as you'll see in the handout, tonight's just going to sort of proceed in 2 parts. The first part is I just sort of introduce the problem of divine hiddenness first, as Lewis does, like in the world of Till We Have Faces, and then I'll introduce Schellenberg's argument as well. And then in the second part, I'm going to give 3 different responses that I think that we see in Lewis, that in Till We Have Faces particularly, not just Lewis generally, that would be good responses to Schellenberg. And then I also think there's a couple of them that are similar to responses that already exist in the philosophy of religion literature, which I think is an interesting fact as well, because Lewis predates this conversation by about 50 years. So I think we'll do that, and it should be fun. And then so I'll do, again, I'm going to partially read, partially just sort of talk through this. So if it seems a little disjointed, I apologize. But then at the end, we'll talk some Q&A. I should go for 20 or 30 minutes or so. So let's talk about divine hiddenness. So Till We Have Faces, a little introduction to it for those that don't know, is, as the subtitle says, a myth retold. The original is Apuleius' tale of Cupid and Psyche. You might have heard it before, where the love of Cupid and Psyche is characterized by Cupid's visiting Psyche in the bedroom, but forbidding her to look upon his face. So that's sort of the myth that Lewis is working with, and he reworks it quite a bit. But Till We Have Faces is set in the pre-Christian pagan world, and it's a fictional world, of Glome, Glome. And it's the story of Orual. Now, this is a really hard name to say. So it's Ourual, Orual. And so I've heard it said, and I just can't say it well. And so I'm just going to call her O. Okay, so whenever I say O, that's who I'm talking about. But O is the daughter of the king of Glome. But she's a princess. Although she's a princess, she is not fit to marry a prince because, as she is continually reminded by her father, she is ugly. There are a number of significant characters with which she interacts. She has a sister, Redival. She has a Greek mentor called the Fox. And there's a loyal soldier, Bardia, who she also interacts with quite a bit. But none are as significant as O's half-sister, Psyche. In contrast to O, Psyche is beautiful, and she has this semi-divine quality that she's just loved by everyone, most of all O. And they formed a really close bond, but this bond is tragically severed when the people of Glome demand a perfect, innocent sacrifice to the god, the local god Ungit. And the sacrifice they demand must be Psyche. So she is tied to a tree, and she's left for the god to devour her, as is the custom of Glome. After some time has passed, O is convinced that she must go and search for Psyche, and what she finds truly shocks her, a fully healthy Psyche who claims to live in a palace and to be married to a god. Unlike Psyche, O has a conflicted relationship with the gods, mostly characterized by disdain. And the first book of Till We Have Faces is O's accusation against the gods. So this is a point of clarification. In Till We Have Faces, there's book 1 and book 2. So if you think of Mere Christianity has book 1, book 2, book 3, book 4, it's kind of like that. Book 1 makes up about 90 or 95% of the novel, and it's O's telling her story and accusing the gods. And then book 2 we'll get to in a moment. But O's trouble with the gods, I think, can be characterized in a few different ways. For instance, Jason Dusing sees Orual as a picture of the struggling unbeliever who cannot believe in that which is invisible. Similarly, Rebecca Hans says that she places all of her emphasis on the real, the tangible, the visible, and discounts all that is invisible, including the imaginative realm. While I do think it's true that O struggles to see the invisible, because she cannot see the god's palace, for instance, yet her struggle with the invisibility of the gods, I think, is secondary. Her primary issue with the gods, and her primary complaint, is not that they are invisible, but that they are silent. In her opening accusation, she complains that the god of the mountain will not answer me. She has this defining experience with the god at one point. She sees a flash of Psyche's lover, saying of this experience that a monster would have subdued me less than the beauty that his face wore. Yet her objection to this theophany is not that the god is not real or tangible enough for her. It is only that it is a glimpse. She sees this only as divine riddles unbefitting of a god. She says, there's divine mockery in it. They, that is the gods, set the riddle and then allow a seeming that can't be tested and can only quicken and thicken the tormenting whirlpool of your guesswork. If they had an honest intention to guide us, why is their guidance not plain? Even if it is true that O must struggle with something like a sort of soft materialism, a sort of visibility, invisibility, she can believe in the intangible and the invisible. Her protest to Psyche's claim about her lover God hiding his face is, I think, the core of her accusation against the god. She says, nothing that's beautiful hides its face. Nothing that's honest hides its name. Despite seeing a god of blinding beauty, according to her, and with her own eyes, she maintains that everything's dark about the gods. So I think the silence or darkness about the gods is what brings O to make her complaint. Their silence is proof for her that the gods must be unjust, or perhaps even wicked. Although the gods meddle in the affairs of humans, their silence is evidence that they do not really care for them. She says, if they meant us well, the gods would speak. If the gods do exist, then they must not truly be loving towards humans. And I think this passage is particularly telling. This is again O speaking. She says, I say the gods deal very unrightly with us, for they will neither, which would be best of all, go away and leave us to our own short days to ourselves, nor will they show themselves openly and tell us what they would have us do, for that too would be endurable. But to hint and hover, to draw near us in dreams or oracles, or in a waking vision that vanishes as soon as is seen, to be dead silent when we question them, and then to glide back and whisper words we cannot understand in our ears when we most wish to be free of them, and to show one what they hide from another. What is all this but cat and mouse play, blind man's bluff, and mere jugglery? Why must holy places be dark places? O cannot make sense of the hiddenness of the gods, and finds their riddles and whispers unendurable. If the gods did exist, for her, they should be plain. O's complaint is, I think, in modern theological or philosophical terminology, a version of the problem of divine hiddenness. Some of you might be familiar with, I know even Robert and I were talking earlier, about divine hiddenness in the sense that it's found in theologians like Luther or possibly Karl Barth. I'm not here at this moment talking about that kind of hiddenness. It's sort of a different sense, and they're thinking more even of transcendence in some ways, or it's at least closer to the idea of transcendence. Here I'm thinking of it as a problem, like a problem that needs to be solved. Like for what Luther's talking about, the hiddenness of God is just a fact about who God is. I'm thinking of it as there's something that we have to reckon with here. And to help see this even clearer, there's a couple, we might even distinguish between two kinds of divine hiddenness. So the first, or two kinds of the problem of divine hiddenness. The first would be the experienced problem of hiddenness. And the second one would be the philosophical problem of hiddenness. So by the experience problem, I just mean that it's an experience of God's absence when one's beliefs about God would otherwise suggest that God should be present. So you might think of the psalmist David, who inquires of God, how long will you hide your face from me? David's cry is not questioning whether God exists. He's not doubting the existence of God necessarily, but he's expressing confusion or frustration over God's absence, given his beliefs about God's love or goodness. So the experience problem starts from a place of belief. It's a person that believes that God exists, and probably even that God is loving or good, and that God should be present to them, but isn't for some reason. The philosophical problem of divine hiddenness is the problem that I want to focus on from now on, for the most part. And if you're familiar with the literature, it's also been called doxastic hiddenness, or it's similar to this kind of hiddenness as well. And it refers to inquiring whether the traditional claims about God, such as that God is perfectly loving, whether these traditional claims are compatible with God's absence. Rather than assuming belief in God, the philosophical provides an argument for why God, understood in this way, does not or probably does not exist. And I think both kinds are present until we have faces. On the one hand, I think O clearly experiences hiddenness to a degree. She's frustrated at the silence of the gods. But on the other hand, her certainty that if the gods were just, they would not be silent, I think, corresponds to the philosophical problem. The hiddenness of the gods, their failure to make themselves clearly known, provides warrant for her for doubting the justice or even the existence of the gods. And it probably should go without saying, but I should probably clarify anyway, that of course in the pre-Christian world, O is talking about the gods, lowercase g God, but I think it does correspond with uppercase G God. Of course, Lewis being a Christian, but just giving the setting, it usually talks about the gods, and I'll even get to that towards the end as well, but just to be clear as we move forward. So the philosophical problem of hiddenness. I think there are some earlier versions of the argument. It shows up really briefly in people like Hume or Nietzsche and Pascal. But the modern debate, and particularly the analytic in analytic philosophy, has centered around the work of J.L. Schellenberg. And so he originally wrote a 1993 work that has since caused this flurry of articles about divine hiddenness in the philosophy of religion. And he's also he's released other books and articles since then, and so the argument has actually evolved over the years, and there's been some minor alterations and variations. And the newer versions of the argument, I think the most recent one is 2015, are much more nuanced and technical than this version. This version comes from the 1993 work, but I think this one is much simpler and easier to understand. And if we got into all of the nuance of the newer argument, I think it would just take all night. It's not worth it. And the nuance that is in the newer argument, I don't think is relevant to anything I want to say, and it's really not important unless we get into really the details. So his argument, this will give you a good sense of what his argument is. It proceeds like so, and it's on your handout just for reference sake. Premise 1, he says, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving. Premise 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. 3, reasonable non-belief occurs. 4, no perfectly loving God exists. 5, there is no God. That's Schellenberg's argument against God's existence. And it's a valid argument. The premises follow, the conclusion follows from the premises. The question is it sound? Which of these premises do we find problematic if we're going to deny the conclusion? So obviously the key of this argument turns on this question of what is reasonable non-belief. And I won't get too deeply into this, but for him it just refers to this relatively clear phenomenon that there are some persons that do not believe in God, but might if they were given better evidence. And so he just says, think about the traditional claims of God being perfectly loving in particular, but also all-powerful. Surely if God were perfectly loving and all-powerful, he would put every person in a position to be in a relationship with him. And the first step to that is making sure that everybody believes that he exists. So that's sort of the minimum that Schellenberg says that a perfectly loving God would do. And because the perfectly loving God would want to be in a relationship with every person at every time, there is, according to Schellenberg, no time in which God would not provide such evidence of his existence. That's the sort of outline of the argument. And we can get into it more in the Q&A if you want. But the problem for Schellenberg, and I think for O as well, is that the goodness or love of God is incompatible with God's relative hiddenness. His focus on divine love, I think, is evidence of this, because since love, by definition, has in mind the good of the beloved. So if God truly loved us, he would make himself plain to us. Of course, one possible response to this is that God desperately wants to make himself plain to us, but he's simply unable to. But this is a non-starter for most people, for most theists, because the traditional view of God attributes to him omnipotence or being all-powerful. So presumably a consequence of this would be that God could, if he wanted to, appear to any person at any given time and put them in a position that they could believe in God. Since he doesn't do so, and he can do so, then he must not desire to make himself plain, which then would call into question his love or justice or goodness, which is what Schellenberg's argument does, and of course O does as well. And so I think actually Schellenberg's argument could be succinctly summed up in the proclamation of O, when she says, if they meant us well, the gods would speak. So through O, I think Lewis provides this objection against divine hiddenness, but I also think he gives us some responses. So let's look at those responses. So like I said, O's accusation against the gods is a big part of it, but it doesn't end it. It goes into book 2, which is kind of her update on her metamorphosis, on her changing. And so through the second book, I think O's inquiry about the hiddenness of the gods is answered, and I think Lewis provides some responses to hiddenness here. It should be said that since he's writing fiction and not analytic philosophy, the response takes a much different form than, say, Schellenberg's interlocutors. So he doesn't explicitly pick a premise and an argument to deny, or he doesn't provide any syllogisms of his own. But he does offer some responses that I think are interesting, and some that have been even turned into arguments of this sort of maybe more analytic sort. So I'm just going to go through these 3 responses that I've found until we have faces. And if you've seen others, please let me know. But these are 3 that I think you could reasonably say this is present in Until We Have Faces. The first one I think is heard most clearly through the mouth of Psyche. One of the defining passages of the book is O's and Psyche's conversation about whether Psyche is actually being visited by a god. So Psyche tells O that though he is her husband, this god does not allow her to see his face. And Psyche also tells O of this god's mansion that is right before her eyes, but O cannot see it. So I think this, combined with sort of just the brute unbelievability of what she's being told, leads O to doubt if Psyche is really being visited by a god at all. After all, why would a god hide his face? Why would a god, something beautiful, not show himself? O lays this question before Psyche, and she responds like this. He is a god. He has good grounds for what he does, be sure. How should I know of them? I am only his simple Psyche. Psyche's response to O is that the God has good reasons for what he does, even if we cannot or do not know them. So I think a similar response is actually mirrored later as well whenever O presses Bardia, one of the loyal guard, on the matter. Whenever he says, I don't know what's really when it comes to the houses of the gods. Here I think Psyche and Bardia both admit a degree of ignorance when it comes to regarding the works of the gods. And yet in both cases the ignorance is not worrying to them. It's unsurprising to them in some ways that they do not fully understand the gods. So not knowing why the god hides his face does not, for Psyche or Bardia, constitute a reason to doubt the gods as it does for O. In modern philosophy of religion, Psyche and Bardia are semi-defending a position here the same or similar to what's been called skeptical theism. And if you're familiar with the problem of evil literature, you might be familiar with this. Michael Bergman, I think, helpfully defines it by dividing it into two components. He says there's a skeptical component and a theistic component. The theistic component just refers to belief in God. The skeptical theist is theistic in virtue of believing in God. So the skeptical theist is a theist. And then the skeptical component refers to a degree of skepticism about the realm of possibility for knowing the reasons that God might have for permitting certain evils. So just knowing the reasons that God does certain things. So skeptical theism, again, most commonly found in response to the problem of evil, but Robert McKim explores its relevance to divine hiddenness. He argues for what he calls unknown goods of mystery. So, and he further divides this out, these unknown goods of mystery, into two different kinds. Unknown goods that we are capable of being aware of, and unknown goods that we are incapable of being aware of. So there might be all of these goods that God knows about, these goods that can come about from different things that are unknown to us. Some of those might be of the sort that we could know about them, we just don't have the capacity in the moment to know about them. But he says other of them we might actually be incapable of knowing them given our limited capacities. So if God exists, argues McKim, then it's likely that there are manifold goods that are unknown to us but known to God. For McKim, to say that we don't know why God is hidden does not therefore entail that there are no reasons for God to be hidden. Like Psyche and Bardia, there can be an admission of ignorance why God is hidden without the further claim that God has no good reasons for being hidden. So to just see how this works in an example, imagine playing chess against world champion grandmaster Magnus Carlsen. And let's just assume here that everyone is relatively a chess novice and untrained. So if, let's say he made a move that to your untrained chess eyes looked like a blunder, looked like a huge mistake. And this guy's won chess, tournaments and at the highest level. Would you conclude that he had made a mistake? Or would you conclude that it is more likely that his reasons for making that move are beyond our ability to understand why he made that move? Perhaps we cannot understand it, or maybe we could understand it if it was explained to us, but it's just unavailable to us in the moment. Presumably, you would conclude the latter, that it's not that he made a mistake, it's that he has a strategy that we can't understand. In Schellenberg's argument, how this would look is, so premise 2 says that if a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur, which I think depends on a further premise, that a perfectly loving God would have no reason to allow reasonable non-belief. But the skeptical theist can argue that this further premise should not be accepted, and therefore neither should 2. Along similar lines, the skeptical theist can reject 3 by arguing that there are, independent of this argument, good reasons for thinking that God exists. So if one thinks there are good reasons to accept 2 and good reasons for thinking that God exists, then the combination of these 2 would entail a denial of 3. And so if you're fans of 20th century analytic philosophy, like I'm sure all of you are, you might recognize this as the famous G.E. Moore shift or similar to it. In either case, this response, following the thoughts of Psyche and Bardia, does not see God's hiddenness as grounds to question his existence or love on the grounds that we might have reasons, that there might be reasons that we do not or even cannot see. Let's get to the second response, until we have faces. It's less explicit, I think, in the book, but it's more prevalent. So again, at the writing of the first book, O is vocalizing her accusation against the gods, but she begins to change. In fact, it is the very writing of her story, according to her, that begins the God's surgery upon her. She says, "They used my own pen to probe my womb." Hans insightfully points out that it is the highest point of her rebellion against the gods, but also the starting place of her transformation. The writing of her accusation against the gods leads to deep self-reflection about the life she has lived and her motives in her life, exposing the ugliness within her heart. What about her story allows her to see life with fresh eyes? There are a number of significant moments, but two prominent ones are the veiling of her face and her rise to the throne. These are two of, according to Peter Shackle, O's efforts to suppress her old identity, which I think is right. That she is wearing a veil now that no man ever again sees her face, and she becomes the queen of Glome. Her father has died. In becoming the queen, she says that she will kill O. For her, the queen had more and more a part in me, and O had less and less. I locked O up, or laid her asleep, as best I could, somewhere deep down inside me. I found some similarity in biblical language here. I think just as Jesus invites his followers to lose his life for my sake, so that paradoxically their lives can be saved, as in Luke 9:24, so we see Paul say that it is no longer I who lives, but Christ lives in me. I think also the famous quote from John the Baptist shows some similarities to the words of O. He must increase, I must decrease. Of course, mostly the decrease part. But this is not to suggest that Lewis had these verses in mind. I think Shackle, he argues that the pushing back of the old O in this sense of the wearing the veil, the becoming the queen, there is to be reduction. It's not a growth thing. But nevertheless, her attempts to kill the old O are instrumental, I think, in her own selfishness being exposed. As she begins to see her inner ugliness, she is given a vision in which she sees herself as the god Ungit. And here she sees reflected in herself the very picture she has of the gods, selfish, wicked, and veiled. The recognition of her selfishness brings her face to face with the harsh truth. Her failure to hear from the gods may have little to do with the gods and more to do with her. She says, "The voice of the god had not changed in all of those years, but I had." It's only by being exposed for who she truly is, ugliness and all, that she's able to truly meet the gods openly and honestly. And she reflects on this in probably the most famous passage from the book like this. She says, "I saw well why the gods do not speak to us openly, nor let us answer. Till that word can be dug out of us, why should they hear the babble that we think we mean? How can they meet us face to face till we have faces?" The prominent theme on display here is that the voices of the God are not silent, but to hear them might require a sort of inner surgery prior to that fact. God's hiddenness in any particular moment might be due to this instead of a failure on God's part to love us well. So initially, O's transformation might provide a sort of response to Schellenberg by denying that reasonable non-belief exists. The reason that O cannot hear from the gods, after all, is something within herself. Yet it seems plausible that O is still reasonable, according to Schellenberg's use of the term, in her non-belief or doubt of the gods. Instead, what Lewis appears to be pointing here is the need for transformation prior to hearing from God in some cases. In the Hiddenness literature, Paul Moser has rebutted Schellenberg on similar grounds. Moser finds Schellenberg's project problematic for its focus on propositional knowledge, or knowledge which consists of assent to some proposition in response to evidence, such as that God exists. For Moser, God would not be all that interested in providing propositional knowledge of himself, but instead, by upholding redemptive love towards humans, if knowing God is merely propositional, then God's reality is, according to Moser, just reduced to being a spectator sport. Responding to God, he argues, is not a philosopher's response to evidence, but responding to an authoritative call to repent and to obey faithfully and wholeheartedly. Knowing God, then, is what Moser calls filial knowledge, which includes knowing God as one's authoritative and loving Father to whom one yields as God's child in response to a perfectly authoritative and loving call to repentance and fellowship. Long quote. Filial knowledge is, for Moser, morally challenging and morally transforming, and this includes being reconciled to God. Knowing God in this way is far superior to merely knowing that God exists, and yet even reasonable non-believers may not be prepared to respond positively to filial knowledge, i.e. enter into a relationship with God. So accordingly, Moser adds, we may plausibly suppose that some divine hiding stems from such absence of human readiness. So in other words, there's just these reasonable non-believers just are not ready to enter into a relationship with God. And I think O would be an example in the first book of one who's not ready for this kind of filial knowledge. And I think she's probably also guilty of what Moser would call cognitive idolatry, which is demanding a certain sort of knowledge or evidence of God inappropriate to a filial relationship with God. So O is seeking God on her own terms rather than on the God's terms. So as is the human tendency, O repeatedly makes decisions which angle for control, and it is only when she, in her language, kills O that she is able to truly hear from the gods. And as a response to Schellenberg, I think this kind of response denies two by suggesting that God might allow reasonable non-belief for a time in order to allow for some sort of necessary transformation to take place. And this transformation in turn allows for a better, more redemptive knowledge of God at a later time. So in the case of O, her demand for propositional knowledge goes unanswered, but she receives a deeper, truer knowledge of God after her transformation. Finally, the third response to divine hiddenness from till we have faces is, I think, distinct from the other two in that it does not have correspondence in the problem of divine hiddenness literature. Near the end of the novel and O's life, she is visited by another, this time semi-eschatological vision, in which she is brought before the God. Just after this vision, O pens these words. I ended my first book with the words, no answer. I know now, Lord, why you utter no answer. You yourself are the answer. Before your face, questions die away. What other answer would suffice? Only words, words, to be led out into battle against other words. The use of the Lord and you yourself are the answer suggests, I think, that O's vision has shown her the true manner of things, or what Lewis would say is the true manner of things, that there is one God, one Lord, as opposed to the way she had previously conceived of divinity, which is the gods. Either way, this vision for O leads her to see that an answer, any answer, to divine hiddenness that includes words is somehow defective. For her, an experience of God face to face is the only way that God can be truly known. There's an often told story about Thomas Aquinas where he recounts a religious experience he had one day after waxing eloquently on the theology of the Eucharist. Kneeling at the altar, a voice from the crucifix told Thomas that he had written well and asked him what reward he would have for his writings. Thomas responded, I will have thyself, only thyself. Thomas would later tell a friend, I can write no more. I have seen things which make all of my writing like straw. O's response appears to corroborate Thomas's account. After an experience with God, any responses to divine hiddenness are only words, words to be led out to battle against other words. For the problem to be truly solved, a face-to-face encounter with the divine is required, because before God's face, questions die away. Yet, the problem here is that the biblical text is clear that God's face cannot be seen. You cannot see my face, says Exodus 33, for no one may see me and live. How then can we say that God's face could be seen? The testimony of Scripture and the theological tradition says that God's face can be seen and God can be known in the man Jesus Christ. The Father is fundamentally invisible and unknowable, but the invisibility of the Father is overcome in the visibility of the Son, as in John 1:18. Jesus Christ is the image of the invisible God in Colossians 1:15. This fundamental affirmation is echoed through the theological tradition. The light of God is seen first and foremost in the darkness of the cross. At the cross, one comes face to face with divinity. For many of the early church fathers, quote, the transcendent power of the divinity is manifested through the things external to the divine nature, in flesh, in darkness, and in death. For it is here that we contemplate the transforming power of God. Likewise, for Martin Luther, God can only be found in the suffering of the cross. The hidden face of God is seen and revealed in the face of Christ. And Karl Barth, I think, has said it plainly and well, that in his revelation in Jesus Christ, the hidden God has indeed made himself apprehensible. Like O, in response to divine hiddenness, we may simply say, before his face, questions die away. This is the conclusion. Until we have faces, Lewis explores at least two responses to divine hiddenness that predate similar responses to Schellenberg's argument by almost 50 years. What do such responses show us? They show us Lewis's intellectual and authorial prowess, for few writers could weave such philosophically astute responses into a brilliant work of fiction. They show us that Lewis would have willingly and ably engaged Schellenberg and his argument were he alive today. This should be no surprise given his affinity and talent for Christian apologetics. They show us that Lewis saw value in such a defense, particularly, we might guess, when it is done for those honest seekers, those reasonable non-believers who are perplexed by God's hiddenness. And they show us that Schellenberg's argument can be capably responded to, and that believers need not doubt their belief in God because of his hiddenness. And yet, in this very work, Lewis reminds us that these responses show us relatively little. The debate over the hiddenness of God is, after all, only a debate. O describes coming face to face with the God like this. She says, "He made it to be as if all my doubtings, fears, guesses, debatings, questionings had been trumped up foolery, dust blown in my own eyes by myself. Before the face of God, says O, questions die away. The rest is only words to be led out to battle against other words." Finished. Jeez, I was trying to get tunnel vision there at the end. So yeah, sorry about reading all of that. Prefer to be a little bit more conversational, but it's, like I said, I'm going to hopefully present this paper, or turn this paper in for publication. So wanted to at least get some of it read, and love to hear your all's thoughts.
Can you share this with the group, like digitally as well? Like send a copy.
Sure.
Comments.
Yeah.
I'll probably edit it up a bit better first, because I mean this is literally all in the last week, so
Okay.
I need to do a lot of some changing, but yeah. Be happy to. So yeah, I don't know what the best way would be to proceed. I don't know if you have any questions or just comments or critiques. We'd love to hear whatever direction you all want to go. And we don't have to stay really narrowly focused on this. We can float around the
Just
edges.
a clarifying question. So you are suggesting that these are explicit, or these are intentional claims in To Wit Faces. The three responses that Lewis was intentionally weaving these into the narrative.
I don't know. I don't know if I would go that far. I mean, I think I would say. So I think this is a different question than if Lewis were sitting here with us today, and I would say, how would you respond to this? I don't think he would necessarily just say, number 1, number 2, number 3. But I think there are responses. For one, they are responses to divine hiddenness and responses that have been developed in the literature today, which I think is interesting. But I also think that he did mean them in their context to be suggestive in some ways. Like, I do think ultimately, number 3 is where he goes explicitly, because I think he even says, "I know why you utter no answer. You yourself are the answer." But he does that as well in number 2, and number 1 is just really explicit that he clearly thinks of this as important and relevant to the conversation in some way, even if he might not have developed. Like, I don't know, he might look at like the modern forms of skeptical theism and say, I'm not on board with this.
Well, sure.
Yeah, but I do think that he means them to be relevant in the conversation about hiddenness. Yeah, and obviously, as a novel, there's a lot more going on here than just a conversation on divine hiddenness.
Yeah.
But it's certainly a big theme. Like, I think it's probably one of the biggest theological themes that you could identify in the book.
And for Schellenberg, you can have to clarify this too. And the premise too for him, the idea of reasonable non-belief is, I've written down this idea that there should be no instances in which someone can rationally not believe in the existence of God. Is that fair?
No instances in which someone could rationally not believe.
Like, what exactly? Like, how does he articulate himself?
Yeah. So this was actually one of the alterations. The newer version is called non-resistant non-belief. In both cases, what he has in mind, so obviously a non-believer, and what he means by non-believer is just someone that doesn't believe in God. But he just wants to leave space and room for there being people who willfully reject God and because of that don't believe. So you might think of people that would just say, well, I don't want there to be a God, and because of that, it's coloring the evidence that they're looking at. And those people he would call unreasonable non-believers or resistant non-believers. Mm-hmm. He admits, like, this is a possibility, but he just wants to say there are at least some people out there, and really his argument only needs one case, I think, to make it work, is that there's somebody out there that is reasonable or not resisting belief in God. I think is probably I think the newer version is a better way to characterize it. But he means really the same thing here. He just means that they don't have the evidence, and they would respond. They could possibly respond to the evidence if they were given the evidence.
So if someone was confronted with God, if there was some evidence that was convincing to them, they would essentially believe in God or convert to become whatever a Christian. Is that kind of the point he's making? Is that if you could find a case of someone who would be willing to convert and that exists, that seems to make no sense. Is that kind of the point he's trying to raise?
No. So he just wants to say. So he would say that God would put everyone in a position, I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this, in a position or a state in which at that state they either have to say that God exists, so that they've given this evidence. So background on all this, I think some of you guys have been in Keegorn's class. For most philosophers think that we don't choose our beliefs, that belief is involuntary in some way, in the sense of I can't. It doesn't matter how much money you offer me. I can't choose to believe that this isn't there. I might say that I don't believe it, but I really cannot believe that this thing isn't on the table right now, no matter what you do. And so, of course, there are different kinds of beliefs, and there's a whole conversation there. But a lot of philosophers think we can't choose our beliefs. They're just simply a response that we have to evidence. Now, of course, we can shape them in different ways and prior to the fact. So that's going on in his conversation, and then so he wants to say, so then whenever God would put people in a position, either they're going to have the evidence to where they would believe that God exists, or they're going to resist the evidence and become a resistant non-believer or an unreasonable non-believer or something. So it is possible that people reject still, he's not, and then because you said become a Christian, so he's not even concerned with that at this point. He's just saying they would come to believe that God exists. Mm-hmm. He says that's sort of the initial step that has to take place if a relationship is going to form. I was going to say, because we have to believe in somebody for us to have a relationship with them. Mm-hmm. They don't have to become a Christian or whatever to be. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
is that helping a little bit more?
A little bit, yeah. Trying to get some background to him.
It's hard, because you have to really fill out a lot of his thought, I think, to get it fully. So. Yeah,
which seems to kind of be a lot of Moser stuff that you included, which is kind of counteracting this idea that no, you don't really need to assent to the propositional knowledge of God to have a relationship with Him. It kind of seems to be the opposite to a certain degree, where you can have a relationship with God before forming that belief that He exists. You can experience God in this way of being morally overwhelmed. You have these challenges in life, or you encounter something, and it's this question about becoming a better person, becoming more like Christ. If you want to say, he says you can experience God in these ways before you actually I believe in Him, or this.
Yep. And so I think Schellenberg's just going to respond to that and say, but why would God not?
Yeah.
So he's going to say, let's say with any relationship that you have, whether it be with your parents or with your wife. Presumably, your relationship is better when you know that those people exist, and you're able to have. So he uses what he calls a personal relationship, which requires some sort of interaction, some back and forth. He's like, this is the best kind of relationship, and God would want this with all people if He was perfectly loving. And so he's going to say, this kind of relationship where we don't really know that there's a God, but God is interacting with us in some way, but we're not really interacting with Him. He's going to say, God wouldn't really want that. I mean, why? Wouldn't a perfectly loving God want to be in a full personal relationship where you know that God exists? So that's really what he's going to be aimed at. But I mean, I think that Moser still has something of a point there. But I feel like anytime I present Schellenberg's argument, I'm always just defending him the entire time.
But
Say that one more time.
I feel like I'm always just defending Schellenberg whenever I present his argument. I'm usually on just trying to give his argument the best defense I can. But
how does he respond to any sort of eschatological beliefs, or the belief that some of these things will be worked out?
What does eschatological mean?
End times, so anything having to do with the end times, heaven, things like that. So how do those things factor into his argument? Or are they relevant?
So he would say no, they're not relevant, because what he says is he defines God as perfectly loving, and he says this would mean certain things, and one of the things it would mean is that God wants to be in a relationship with every person at every time. And so that means every person in the world and it means every time. So it means it's not good enough to say that God just wants to be in a relationship. I mean, and it's hard to imagine. You imagine God saying like, yeah, I want to be in a relationship with them, just not now, maybe in like 10 years. But that always God wants to be in a relationship with someone. And that for that to happen, he has to put that person in a position where they can believe that he exists. That's what he's going to say. So just saying like, oh, well, this will get worked out in the end and all people will have an opportunity or something like this. Schellenberg's just going to say, well, that's not really my concern, because a perfectly loving person, if God were perfectly loving, then he would want to be in a relationship with those people right now. And then presumably it would be compounded by the fact that a lot of Christians would want to say that what happens in this life actually affects what happens in the next life as well, in some sense. And that the lack of belief in God might actually hurt people's chances to experience him in the next life, or something like this.
I was just wondering if it was relevant for his consideration, but I think I push back on the relationship piece, because if I don't see having a relationship as the highest good, if we reframe it and say that a perfectly loving God would pursue the ultimate flourishing of every person, there may be times where not having a reciprocal relationship would promote further flourishing. And you could use an example of a parent whose child is, addicted to drugs, and it's in their best interest for the parent to stop enabling the behavior, and so the parent cuts the child off. The child hits rock bottom, rebounds, gets into, so there are scenarios where the ultimate flourishing of the individual is going to be enhanced by altering the relationship in some hands. So I don't know how he can dig into perpetual relationship at all times and not have to kind of bow down to God pursuing the ultimate flourishing of.
I think he would respond, though, because the problem with those kind of analogies and examples is the idea that everybody, like, assuming that you have equal access to a parent in the first place. So, like, you have a relationship with your parents and they cut you off, and you've had a relationship prior to that. And so I think I could see him responding in a sense by saying, well, yeah, like, in the Christian narrative, in the Christian story, you have these kind of archetype figures like Adam and Eve, representing like the human head, like the head of humanity, who have access to God. But then for the most part, most people don't begin with just an explicit relationship with God. They begin with just kind of this access. We don't have access to Him, And so I'm not really separation. Yeah. So anyways, I don't know. It's hard for me to kind of I feel like it's hard to really kind of. I think the examples you brought up, I didn't talk about the examples you brought up in that one paper, Derek, because those were good too. But I mean, I can't.
It seems like Schellenberg would push back and say, if you're in a relationship with a perfectly loving God, your ultimate flourishing is going to immediately come out of that relationship, and therefore you would never get addicted to drugs because you have whatever the drugs would give you outside of them. So. Yeah. Does that kind of make sense?
I understand, but I think if we allow for sort of a libertarian freedom, we can allow for a perfectly loving God who allows people to make decisions, like just kind of how he would be okay with resistant non-belief, just not non-resistant non-belief. But to me, I mean, when you talk about, I think we have to use relationships somewhat loosely here, because a parent has a relationship with a child who has no knowledge that the parent exists, and so God can be acting on or on the behalf of an individual without the individual's knowledge that it's God or whatever. So I don't see that there has to be reciprocal knowledge that God is acting on the behalf of someone for it necessarily to happen and for him to be pursuing their ultimate flourishing. So I still see the ultimate flourishing as something that doesn't require for them that
you don't
all
think
times
there has to be that acknowledgement, basically, of God. Hey, this is God doing this.
If a mom and dad are changing their infant newborn who has no concept of, can't even see them because they can only see 6 inches in front of their face, the parent is still acting on behalf of the child.
Absolutely.
So I don't see that the child has to be at all times knowledgeable or interacting in the relationship for them to be benefiting from reciprocating.
So yeah, just to be clear, he doesn't think that either. He doesn't think that. I think. So what he is concerned with primarily is whether people believe that God exists, meaning just that someone that would just say, I believe that God exists. And like that, he's not saying there needs to be perpetual relationship. He just is leaving room for, he understands that like relationship, even in his picture and what he's saying, relationship can still be the end or highest goal or aim, a personal relationship of that kind. And I think he would say that, God would want to be in a personal relationship with all people at all times. But the way that you get there, like the sort of first step that he's saying God would take with all people, is not making sure that they're in a personal relationship with every person at every time, just making sure that every person has the capacity to enter into that relationship if they wanted to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So with the case of the parents and their druggy son, let's say, that they would just... The son knows that the parents exist and can always go back to them. And so in that case, they wouldn't be... Schellenberg isn't going to say, no, the parents, if they were really loving parents, they would have to be in the life of their son in that moment. Just that they would have to, at least at some point, have told the son that they exist, and that the son knows that he could be in a relationship with them if he chose. Does
So
that make
there
sense?
is it like
Yeah.
the whole book with the premises, like kind of back to the question I asked earlier. So basically, the idea of reasonable non-belief has more to do with the will. Like if someone would desire to know if God is real, that God exists, and has that and expresses that desire, has that desire, like just hidden whatever, and still goes on in a state of reasonable non-belief. Like he would say that essentially, how can a God be loving and let someone continue in that state who would desire to know him, and has that implicit?
Yeah, I think it could take a few different forms. I think that's the most difficult to explain. We probably all know people or have at least heard of people that would say something like, "I really want there to be a God. I just don't see the evidence for it. Like I just and by all accounts are genuine and are honest in saying, I've looked, I've sought, I've prayed, I just don't see the evidence." That would be the most difficult cases, I think, for Christians or theists to explain. But it could take other forms as well. So it could just be someone that grew up in an environment and where just God was assumed there was no talk of God, and so they didn't know of God, and that was never a thing that they've thought about. Just completely, not even agnostic, just ignorant of the conversation of whether there is such a thing as God. So that could be another case or something like this. You might think of some tribes or something that have, maybe they have some sort of particular religious expression, but it's nothing like theism. And so in that sense, they would be, at least some of the people could be non-resistant non-believers or reasonable non-believers as well. That makes sense. But the case that you're saying, I think, it does get to the heart of it. There's these people that, even if they don't want to be in a relationship with God, just to say, I would love to believe that there is a God, even.
So the apologists, C.S. Lewis's whole approach, kind of just, I guess, now in part 2 here, it seems, it's really responding to that. Like, can you explain how reasonable non-belief occurs? Can you give some teeth to that, give some meaning to that? In a way, hey, why God? There could be a perfectly good reason God would allow this. Skeptical theism, need for development, be it to, meeting God face to face.
So really, I think what you just said too would be the response number 2 would be the only one that would fit that bill of
the need for
in the need for development. Lewis is giving a reason why reasonable non-belief might exist for a time, right? And why God might allow reasonable non-belief and still be considered perfectly loving.
Yeah.
That's what Lewis is doing. I think that's what the second response is doing. And the first response is just, we don't know why there's reasonable non-belief, and that's okay. And it just means it's just sort of a response to Schellenberg's argument, but in that way, by just saying that we don't have to know, and we can still be reasonable in our belief of God.
Does Schellenberg, in his literature that you found, I'm curious, does he have a demand for immediacy, like God would need to immediately reveal himself? Or could he foresee any sort of situation where God might even temporarily just not reveal himself to someone? How does he react to those kind of?
Yeah, so I think every person at every time just sums it up well. So meaning God would want to be in a relationship with people right now, and so that God would always put people in a position to where it's not necessarily a need for immediacy in that sense. He's just saying, by the definition of perfect love, like embedded in what it means to be perfectly loving, you're going to want to be in a relationship with every person every time. In other words, you can't imagine God looking at Evan and just saying, I don't really want to be in a relationship with you right now, even if you want to be in a relationship with me.
It hurts.
Yeah, it hurts. That's right. I mean, look at the shirt. But I love the shirt, actually. So, yeah.
But you want to refresh
No, go ahead.
I'm trying to just think through some of these things. And one of the problems I have with this argument is that he's presuming to a couple different things now. I know we're not talking about Schellenberg, but specifically, but number one is the idea of being perfectly loving. Is that a phrase that he uses particularly?
Mhm.
Okay. So that phrase in itself, I don't think is completely mirrored in Christian theology, because God, in John it says God is love.
Mm-hmm.
We assume that makes him perfectly loving, but then just to say perfectly loving, I mean, this is like, there's a theory, a communication theory called meaning of meaning, that says that words don't mean things, people mean things. Now,
Sure.
you can debate that if all you
Sure.
want to do. Like if I say the word dog, everybody has a different picture in mind of what specifically dog means, right? Like you have different. But for him to say perfectly loving, that is such a subjective phrase to me
Mhm.
that it's him defining what that means and then holding that standard to God. And I've just been thinking through, as you've been reading this, just going through scripture and Christian experience, where one, do we even like, there's this idea that you can't even know what perfect love is until you start to enter into your transformed. So even when, this is because I do a lot of evangelism
Mm-hmm.
all over the world and stuff. And one of the things I find is that people, they think they know what something is, but they don't even have a concept for it. It's like if you've never seen a color and you've heard about this color, but until you've actually experienced the color, you really are ignorant of the color. You've heard about it. You've heard about pink. You've heard about it. You've read stories about it, and you say pink, perfectly pink should be like this, but you've never really ever seen
Mm.
experience and handle perfect pink, right? So I mean, this is just one of my problems with like just the phraseology of this is perfectly loving, like.
How does he quantify that?
That's
like,
what I'm saying.
That doesn't really make any sense. Like, I can come up with any definition I want to of it, and if I say it is, then that's what I think. But it doesn't necessarily mean that is the real definition.
That's
of
what it is. Yeah, I think you guys are bringing up a really good point, and even Mike Ray is a philosopher. He has a new book called Hiddenness of God, released last year with OUP, and it is one of the big responses. He talks about God's transcendence and even what it would mean, what it means to apply concepts like perfect love to God. So I'll tell you how Schellenberg would respond to what you all are saying, though, is he would say something like this. He would say, well, he's like, I don't really care what you would call it, or if you want to call it perfect love or whatever. He would just say that first of all, he would say something like this. So look at the way a parent loves a child. And we would say that parent is loving a child. And we have some sort of idea of what, because he admits, he's like, I get that like concepts when we apply them to God are a little bit different. But he's like, the idea of love is our concept. So let's think about how we use love in other cases. So one of his big things is the parent analogy. And he says, think about this, the hiddenness case with respect to parents. You really can't imagine a parent who would put their child in a position where the child didn't know that the parent existed in the way that if they were going to really truly act in a loving way towards the child, is sort of where he would go. And he would say, in really any case of love that we can think of, any human instance of love, we would say, well, the person, another place that he goes is there's a famous definition of love from Thomas Aquinas, and then Eleanor Stump has sort of made it famous recently, but that there's two interconnected desires of love. The desire for union with the beloved, and the desire for, I forgot what the other one is. Oh, the good of the beloved. You would desire. So if you really love, so if I love Nick, I would desire his good, and I would want to be in union with him. And so he just hones in on the union side of that and says, God would desire union with all people with everybody if he loved them. And so I think what you guys are saying actually is a good point, and it's going to be a part of my dissertation. But I also think that it's true that in any sense that we would use love in a human scenario, we would mean that a truly loving action would include some sort of making yourself known to the other person and some sort of desire for union. And to be fair, that would look different depending on the relationship. But presumably, if love does mean anything, it means at least something like that, a desire for good and a desire for union, again, to some degree. And again, that can be cashed out in different ways, but
I don't think anyone would disagree with that.
Well, I
yeah, possibly.
You
I mean,
disagree with
I know
that?
that even Go ahead.
Without.
I'm getting I do. I'm getting back to number 2, but I think if God is pursuing someone's ultimate flourishing, and their ultimate flourishing involves them not knowing God exists right now, then I can see a loving person, a loving parent. I mean, yes, it's not normative, but I think we also, if in any situation, if we're trying to pursue the highest good, we may do something that's not normative. And if we look at God as a unique case, if God's goal is to produce the highest level of flourishing for an individual, and as we said, you noted, if we just need one example to refute like a philosophical thing, there is an example in which someone who's loving would hide their existence if it promoted the ultimate flourishing. So to me, there's enough grounds to where by the all times, all people at all times, that's simply not true if God's pursuing ultimate flourishing, because there are times when a person would hide their presence for the ultimate flourishing of someone. So if their increased development, which could lead to a more vibrant relationship in the future, would be helped by my absence. For their ultimate flourishing, I could hide myself. And we could find kind of quirky human test cases in which a parent might, somehow find out they have a child when the child is, older and has a family, and might feel that somehow, if I step into their life right now, I might disrupt things, and so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to love from afar. And I'm not saying that's the right call. I'm just saying that a person pursuing the ultimate flourishing of someone may choose to step back for the ultimate flourishing of that person. So I do think that ultimate flourishing does involve reciprocal relationship, but that's why I think eschatological considerations are relevant, because you can have a temporal period of absence which leads to ultimate flourishing that will culminate in an eschatological reciprocal relationship.
There's a certain amount of preparatory work.
Absolutely, and that's number 2 is the need for development. So I think for the need of development, you can have absence and even non-resistant non-belief, because you may not know what needs to change about you. You may even think that you're non-resistant, and you are resistant because you're defining the terms that God has to appear to you on. Oh, I wish God would just. But you're the one who's establishing the criterion by which you will believe God exists. And I'd like, I'm just tossing this out, but Matthew Bates' work on, salvation by allegiance alone, which kind of says it's not really about you being convinced, it's about your allegiance. And your ultimate flourishing and relationship with God could actually be furthered when you don't believe, because you've chosen to give God your allegiance irrespective of your belief. So I think that number 2 does provide something that Schellenberg hasn't answered in his all times, all people criteria, with that criteria. And then secondly, I think it would be very interesting to kind of explore some of Matthew Bates' stuff and see how he kind of sits with any of that.
So I was saying, Rob, the desire component about when it comes to the 2 desires of Aquinas. That's all I'm saying, is that I don't think anyone would disagree with that, in a sense that, because I think time is unless you throw additional conditions in there, which you can toss conditions into, for example, if you desire the good of someone, or we can parse out what that looks like. And because I agree with what you just said, I'm more so saying that Schellenberg seems to me there has to be the sense of consistency and immediacy that I'm with you. I don't see that needs to be the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why does it have to be in the immediate that God's revealing Himself?
Absolutely, ultimately,
in the moment,
yes, I
constantly.
agree.
Right. Yeah, or because it could be then when we have this in our lives all the time, we all have these experiences of God. I'm not consistently experiencing God, and from my own experience, I have moments where I have, or maybe I have this really intense experience, this religious experience with Him, where I'm like, man, that was really life. I was it's so random too. Sometimes the other day I was driving down the road, and I all of a sudden was hit with this assurance, everything God is real, and He's loving, and all these things, just boom out of nowhere. I was driving past a gas station. What it was that just triggered that, I don't know. We had these
petroleum, bro.
The petroleum, yes.
Petroleum, bro.
But I had this deep assurance, that insurance I read about in Romans, and I'm like, but it's again if I was constantly looking for immediate confirmation of that, that's what I kind of wonder about Schellenberg is when it comes to what Rob brings up, this idea of why is it there's this consistency that needs to be involved? Why does there seem to be this? Because regardless of how he might duck and weave around that seems to be the point, is that you can't. Because I know from your examples we read in your paper, you're kind of speaking to some. You have kind of similar examples that are set up this way of there could be plenty of examples why someone who's loving wouldn't reveal themselves, and because
So my examples are they might be what you're talking about, and that's why I want to ask you a little bit more. And to respond again to the point of immediacy or constancy, or like, so Schellenberg is not requesting, or he's not suggesting that if God were perfectly loving, he would have to be present in some way to every person at every time, right? So he's just saying that every person at every time, he would at least put them in a position to where they would be able to believe that God exists, just like you do. Yeah. So it doesn't. So for you, for instance, if Schellenberg's requests were granted and there was no such thing as reasonable non-belief, and it's at least possible that God's relationship with you doesn't change at all. Mm-hmm. And in fact, God's relationship, in a technical sense, might not change with anyone in the world. It just means that there are more people. Everyone would either believe that God exists, or that they would be resistant to the belief. Mm-hmm. They would be pushing back against it.
But everyone would have equal evidence for.
Everyone would have. They may not have equal evidence, but they would at least have evidence to where
adequate
they
evidence.
Either do believe in God, or it's their fault that they don't. More or less. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So he doesn't necessarily require immediacy or constancy. It doesn't require God to be constantly doing things for every person. It just requires him to put people in a certain state or position. Sure. And I want to get back really quickly before I forget to your question on flourishing, because there's a few different ways this could go. So first of all, what he said, again, what Schellenberg would respond, maybe he would ask you this question. He would say something like, well, I think every good... So yeah, we might imagine cases of parents that. So one example is in the literature is somebody's come up with an example of a parent of a long lost child who they discover they're about to participate in this really important event. Like, let's say they're an Olympian and they're about to participate in the Olympics, and the parent realizes that this is their child 2 days before their big event. The parent might withhold their evidence of their existence, so withhold themselves for a time, good for the flourishing of the child or something. Schellenberg is going to say we might be able to come up with human examples of that, but God's love is different, and that every good that we could imagine is a relationship-compatible good. And certainly it would be compatible with everyone knowing that or believing that God existed. So he's just going to say, he would ask you, he would say, is there any example of flourishing that you would think a person would be better off if they didn't have a relationship with God? Can you come up with a case of that where they would flourish more in this instance if God weren't present to them?
Yeah.
Or not even not present to them, just hadn't shown up in their life or something like this. I don't know.
Sure. I think that if a person had damaging beliefs about God that they were to, and they projected those onto God, it would be better, because Jesus talks about, and the Bible talks about, it would be better that they had never believed than for them to have believed and fallen away. I mean, there are instances in which Jesus says you'd be better off not even knowing God existed. So yeah, I mean, if in the end you project onto God things that are so damaging and inappropriate, it would be better that you didn't have that, waited until later, and then had proper beliefs. Yeah, I can see an example of that.
I feel like Schellenberg would respond by saying that the idea of perfectly loving, though, would counteract any negative image you can impose upon the ultimate. So, like, it's just going to be an overwhelming love that you experience in that moment.
Yeah, I think he would say, wouldn't the best way to correct that negative perception of God be for God to show up, or something like that? And that may be. I'm just saying. Again, I'm just giving Schellenberg.
No, sure. I think when you talk about like things like the same sun that melts the wax hardens the clay. I mean, we talk about how in the presence of God, people may feel peace. Righteous people may feel peace, and people who are not righteous are kind of eradicated. Or we think about the holiness of God driving away evil, and so if we find ourselves in the story of the Old Testament, sometimes we might be Canaanites and sometimes we might be the Jews, but ultimately all of us are sometimes on both sides of the aisle at some point in our life. And so, is it in our best interest for God? Like it talks about how God, waited to enact judgment in order to allow people to come and know Him. So if God shows up, you might, if you're in a state of righteousness, you might think it's better that God shows up and you feel this beatific, you see the beatific vision. It's also possible though that the sin within you, you're an enemy of God, and God's presence is not a benefit to you in that sense because you're still an enemy of God, and so your soul is at war with God, and your experience of God would not be positive, it'd be very negative because your soul is at war with God. So it would be better to postpone that until your heart was cultivated to a place of peace and love in which you would experience God in a positive way. But I don't see it being a positive thing for us to be put into a situation where we experience God, but there are negative effects because we are in a state of sinfulness, which is why I think number 2 is still so important, that we would need to be transformed before God's presence would be a benefit to us. Otherwise, it would be very destructive because we're enemies.
Good.
To answer the question directly, can I conceive of a circumstance where like there is some good where God's not in the picture? I would say yes, and I would say that depends on how you measure good. If you if you think about like back to ancient forms of philosophy, Epicurean philosophy, it's back to a life of like immediacy. It's back to a life of pleasure. If you're chasing pleasure constantly, and your idea of like an immediate good versus like because I think as Christians, our idea of a good, throughout the Christian tradition, throughout Scripture, we read of like ascetic, specifically like denying yourself to certain forms. We deny ourselves, or we kind of rein ourselves in a little bit for the understanding of the greater good, for a good that is to come. A now but not yet kind of emphasis. And so we have, this is all the discussions about ascetics, is there something, like the monk, should we deny ourselves? Should we be painfully just living a miserable existence in service to God? And I think the ancient forms of the good was no, it's about chasing pleasure. If I can have a more pleasurable experience in the moment. And I think a lot of Christians, one of the main reasons I hear people saying they're not Christians is because, why can't I just do what I want? Man, why can't I experience all the good I want and you just soak in all these pleasures and experiences in life and just kind of live in the moment? Why you're the one who seems like you're trapped. And so I kind of hear that from people sometimes. There's this seems like you have to deny yourself. So I think we have a different understanding of the goodness and this higher understanding of the greater good, versus where I think a lot of people are kind of more narrow-minded. Well, let's live here in the moment, in the here and now. And so I could conceive maybe someone who could twist something like that and say, yeah, there's all sorts of goods I'd be giving up. But those are more kind of again back to the word of immediate, like living in the moment. The pleasure for here and now. I'm living just to satisfy, the kind of
the YOLO philosophy.
Say what?
YOLO philosophy.
Yeah, the YOLO philosophy. And so I don't personally agree. I am a Christian, so I don't agree with that. I think there's a goodness that comes from some of the things we see in Scripture, like the focusing on just my wife, just having a single vision on her. She's the only woman in my life. There's so much goodness that comes from that. The world doesn't know that. I don't see that, but again, those are kind of things where if I was going to, I would probably start there. If you could conceive a case where, hey, there's some good that would be greater to.
I want to throw this out, and I don't want to shut up because I've talked too much, but I just think it's consistent in the Christian message. There's always been allow something that seems negative for like Paul talks about. If the resurrection didn't happen, we're to be pitied above all, because there is this eschatological hope that's meant to make sense of present struggles. We talk about a thorn in the flesh. You might could make the same argument. Wouldn't a loving God never allow anything bad to ever happen to anyone, as in Paul's thorn in the flesh? But the verse that God's power is made perfect in weakness indicates that there is a greater degree of flourishing that happens if this thing persists. And so I think the Christian message has always been filled with an investment of now, which may seem negative, which will yield something positive that is greater in the future. So I just feel like that's very consistent within the Christian message. I'm sorry for shutting up.
Yeah, are there thoughts from people that haven't really talked or questions? You don't have to talk.
I just had a question about your response number 3, because it was on meeting God face to face and how that kind of goes into it. And I just had 2 questions on that. The first one being that I feel like the point of that was kind of to say all the questions go away whenever we meet him. But if we're using this as an argument against him, not everyone does meet him, so you can, so then you would still have the ability for reasonable non-belief. But my question is, even if you do, you still have. My question I wrote down was, how could I be sure this meeting, God face to face, was not entirely in my head? Mm-hmm. How could I be sure of that? Because he could still say that, I think, if you're trying to go against his argument. You have that.
Yeah. That's really good. So I actually debated about whether to even call this a response, just because of what you're pointing at, because in that sense it doesn't pick a premise necessarily and say this premise is wrong.
Yeah.
But I do think in a sense it at least is a response, because ultimately what it's suggesting is that responses to this problem are going to be inadequate, and this is really maybe it would even just point to saying, maybe the response to Schellenberg's argument would say something like this: the whole debate is sort of ill-conceived, because we can have questions and we can ask why God isn't more obvious to us, but ultimately the only way that this is going to be subsided ultimately is an experience with God and coming into him face to face. And so I think, yeah, even so in that sense, yeah, Schellenberg certainly would not be at all compelled by this response. And I'm not trying, it's not aimed at Schellenberg. I just think ultimately this is where
this is how all the doubts are cast aside, you think?
Yeah, and I think even like your question of, well, how do I know it's not in my head? And I think part of it is because the answers have gone away. Before your face, questions die away, and there will be no doubt in some sense.
Yeah.
And it's that having an experience with God is... I really wanted this to be in there as just a reminder that we can play with words and games all day long in philosophy of religion, but ultimately this is where...
So it's kind of more like, this one would be more to like Christians, and then the other two would be more for the serious.
No, I mean, I think all of them can be ones that Christians find interesting or compelling. I think if anyone asked me like why God is hidden, I don't think I would ever like say just number 3 and then that be it, and that'd be like the only response I gave them. But I do think I would say something like, either at the beginning or at the end, saying like, look, ultimately God's hiddenness is only going to be overcome by a revelation from God, and specifically of Jesus Christ. And so if apart from that, there's always going to be a degree of hiddenness, and even the Bible talks about that. And again, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. And so I think that just needs to calibrate the discussion a bit more.
Okay, so you're
more
just
than
kind of
anything.
like a more like think on this or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it can still be a response. Like, I didn't really develop it in like an analytic way, and maybe I should, is like, how would this actually respond to Schellenberg's argument? I think it would probably do so by, and maybe it would probably be similar to skeptical theism. Like, it doesn't really matter. Like, I've had this experience with God, and I know that God exists. I know that God is real because I've seen him face to face. But ultimately, I think it also just gives hope to reasonable non-believers, is that there is an experience with God. But yeah, I think if the response was sort of flushed out, it would just say the argument sort of ill-conceived, because what we're really doing is just talking about, again, the sort of to be like only words to be led out to battle against other words. It's like we can debate words all day long, and we can get analytic and think about, let's just rebut premise 2 or premise whatever. But the response is sort of like, it doesn't really matter if you have an experience with God. That's what's actually really hard to articulate about this, and why I don't think I don't think I can articulate this in an analytic way, because I think, as I say somewhere, like what I think this response does is it says that any response to divine hiddenness that includes words at all is somehow defective.
Yeah.
And that even this whole paper is going to be somehow, this is one of the things that I said here, is that like, I think that's part of what the response does, is that this vision shows that any argument or any words in the sense are going to be defective in some way. They're not perfect responses to divine hiddenness. Only coming face to face with Jesus can be the only perfect response to hiddenness. And so in that sense, it really can't be developed as a clear, tight response to Schellenberg, if that makes sense.
That makes sense, for sure. Because, I mean, like, you can't really perfectly describe experience, even.
Yeah. I think that's right.
No. That makes sense.
Interesting thought. I mean, I just keep thinking about John, where Jesus says, I desire you to be one as with the Father, as I am with the Father is one. Where it's like, he's letting me know this is the desire is not just for you to be saved, which is important. It's actually to be one. It's like completely unified. And he doesn't say like just unified. He says, as I am unified. If you use that as a standard, and all the claims that Jesus made and the miracles and the signs and the wonders that attest to that, that's a pretty deep level of oneness with the Lord.
Yeah.
It's like so close that your thoughts are exactly his thoughts. You have complete access to everything, and authority is given to you. It's pretty. There's something else you said too that these are just thoughts jumping off of your thoughts here. The hiddenness of God. When I was a student at Asbury, I'm a professor now, I had a professor who was my discipleship teacher, and he would just, he's a very analytic guy. He was an MIT guy, math guy, and he would go through his Bible studies. He would just read directly, just translate directly from the Greek. Like, he was really, really profoundly intelligent and really well equipped. But he struggled with the hiddenness of God to the point where he would write a book about, like, he just felt like God's face was always hidden from him. that was something that he constantly struggled with. And it bothered me because there's something inside of me that just felt like there's something about that that's not right. It shouldn't be that way. I mean, I'd be interested to see your responses to this, but this is something that, and we talked a little bit about this when I came last time, like my teaching of color theory, it's so theological, like the creativity of art and color, because it actually like, it's the bookends of Scripture. Is imagination leads to material. Imagination leads to recreation and colors, and all of that is the bookends of Scripture. Actually, it sets the stage of everything we know. But yet, we're so analytical as a culture, Western culture particularly, where it's so linear. I just think about this because one of the things I've noticed over the years in my color theory class is that people, and I think this has to do with the problem with evil, and I can't remember the philosopher who really tackled that. Was it Hume who tackled that? Or who was the one who really tackled that? Got not the existential problem of evil, but actually like just the philosophical problem of evil.
Like recently?
Plantinga?
Yeah.
Plantinga. And he came to that, and one of the things I keep thinking about is that, and it's funny because I came from a very, very Calvinist background, and I came from a very cessationist background, but I had really charismatic experiences like underneath the cover of that, which was confusing to the pastors. And their response was when I went to my youth pastor and I said, well, I had this experience, I had this baptism of the Holy Spirit experience, and spoke in tongues, and the waves of the Father, Son. It was very much like Charles Finney's experience. If you read Charles Finney's testimony, that's almost exactly my experience.
Wow.
And his response to that was, well, we don't believe this happens anymore, so it must be the devil. Which is an interesting philosophy. Right? But my thoughts about this is that I've come to the conclusion that love has to have a sense of choice. I've come full circle with this. Only through experience and through Scripture with this. I don't know whether you agree with that or not. It's just where I've come to with this. But that the hiddenness of God is a stage of free will, where something else. I'm just responding to your thoughts in your paper here, where Job sets the stage in the New Testament, where Jesus talks about the woman and the judge, sets the stage where I think sometimes there's multiple purposes for rooms. We talk about multi-purpose rooms.
Yeah.
But the throne room is not just a throne room, it's a courtroom. And we think about judgment as accusations, but scripturally in the New Testament, a judgment is coming to your aid when there's been an injustice, right? God coming to your aid. And I'm sorry for talking a long time.
No,
I'm just trying
to
parse out my thoughts on this, is that in Job, what we see here is that God is actually active in the process of allowing his love to be tested. And that faith is measured by the test of the hiddenness in Job. And it was God who actually, it's painful to people, but he's the one who actually sets up the challenge, right? Satan, where have you been? Roaming from the earth. Have you considered my servant Job? And then he basically loves Job and allows Job to be tested for I don't have answers for this, but there's something about love being tested to be proven to be true. Like the cross, right? So it's like the fact that Job loved God was the outcome of the love, the proving of the love was that the love was tested and shaken and the face was hidden. It was actually like proof of love. Does it make sense what I'm saying? I'm just like working through these things as I'm responding to your idea of the hiddenness, because anyways, other stuff.
Yeah, no, so this response has been developed in a few different ways, mostly based on, if you're familiar with his work, St. John of the Cross. He has the
Dark Night of the Soul.
the Dark Night of the Soul, and how really God's hiddenness, or even it's been called like divine weaning, is not to be looked at as a curse, but as a blessing, and it's a deepening of relationship with God, and it allows for great opportunity. And so some different theologians have even played with this as a response to Schoenberg's problem.
Well, what about this? What if his face is not really hidden because we just don't understand the rules? What if on the earth, this is where I was getting with this.
Okay.
What if in linear Western culture, we believe something because evidence is presented. I spent a lot of time doing work with the kind of like persecuted church in Israel, the Jewish church, but the Semitic idea is something very different, where actions and belief are one. What if we have experiences because we believe, rather than we have experiences, or you could say we have evidence because we believe? And what if free will is so strong that you won't even get evidences until you make the decision to believe the unseen kingdom? Because the accusation by Satan is that they only believe you because you've given them evidences, or whatever.
Yeah.
But the moment that we decide that we want that, evidences appear. And I don't think it's just cognitive dissonance. You guys know what that means? When I talk about that theory where it's like you buy a Camaro and then suddenly you see Camaros everywhere. I don't think that that's what I mean by that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just jumping back and just causing.
No, I think that's right, and I think that is what certainly a way, putting the argument aside for a second, that is what you would counsel, I think, people to do when they were experiencing hiddenness, is to say, get involved in the church and practice faith, basically.
Yeah.
Fake it till you make it. And I think a lot of times that
the act actually.
Yes, the ritual of going to church and being a part of a lived community. And I think that I actually think that makes sense of a lot of people's experiences. Is that, and I know, so I also work now in a campus ministry on UK's campus, and we often say we want to be a place where people can belong before they believe. And we see, I think, so often that people come in and are part of the community before they have any beliefs about who God is or whatever. But then it just sort of, it's almost what C.S. Lewis calls the good infection, where they just sort of catch it. And I think that
find
is
themselves believing.
Yeah. And I think that's what happens.
And like that idea, when you say that Schellenberg is saying a perfectly loving God would put people in a position to believe, what position is that? Like, because I feel like reasonable non-belief would be to say or presume that the evidence is the same for everybody, and that when faced with the evidence, you absolutely believe. But you say there are people who say, well, I've saw it, but I don't see the evidence. Well, but there have been people who have saw it and have found the evidence. So are those unreasonable believers? It seems weird to assume that evidence, once we came across it, would be totally known. If there are people who believe and say to have found evidence, well, then are those people just lying? Do they not actually believe, and they're faking it or putting up a front to the people around them? I don't know. I guess I don't entirely understand what he would say. Like what the position would be that he would put somebody in order to, when faced with evidence, believe in him.
To that, Marcus, too, I'd say, bro, because on your point, I think most of the West, like you said, Chris, is obsessed with satisfying the rational appetite. And when it comes to evidence, you can always, I think you may have had discussions about this. Specifically, in the Catholic notion of the beatific vision, at the end of Dante's Paradiso, it just cuts off abruptly because Dante stands before the face of God. Yes. He's there. It ends. What else can you say? And that's the point. Dante's trying to get. He's like, what more can I say at this point? Once you've had the divine vision, the beatific vision, and I always kind of think, throughout the course of Western philosophy, it's been attempting to satisfy the reason of man. It's satisfying this idea of the rational appetite is finally quieted. I'm not convinced by that. I never have been. The idea that reason is what's satisfied. I think it's the soul that's satisfied. I think it's this when it comes to meaning, it's like for Lewis, it's not so. I wrote this down. It's not so much that what more can be asked rationally, but what more can be asked to satisfy my soul. At that point, because you can always ask another question. I've heard this. You can infinitely ask more questions. Yes. But that's kind of, if I think the whole point is that's not the purpose of faith is not so much satisfy reason, but satisfy the soul. We talk about that through Scripture, and I think it's much more to do with that. And so, but from an evidence perspective, you can always ask something new. There can always be a new way to look at something from a rational standpoint, infinitely. And so, but Lewis is really flexing his orthodox muscles a little bit, isn't he?
Yeah.
So,
I was thinking about this kind of throw this out there because before I came, there's an Asbury professor. I'm not gonna. It's a her that I was talking with, and in the church that we both go to, we've seen a lot of miraculous events happen that were publicly testified. You know, like somebody had lost, a young man had lost hearing for 20 years and had been prayed for, and his hearing was immediately restored. And I was just in a conversation with her on the way to her building, and I said, well, what do you think of all that? I don't know why I asked her that. I just said, and she said, well, I think, she says, it's good for me. It makes me really stretch myself, and it's difficult because I tend to be academically skeptical. And my takeaway from that was, I just been thinking to myself, like, what exactly did she mean by that? Like, what does it mean to be skeptical? Because if I came to her and I said, do you believe that water hydrates you? She would not slow down and say, I'm not sure if water really hydrates you. Because you could be skeptical of that if you wanted to be. How do you define, like, the parameters of skepticism? Like, and I just feel like part of it is so subjective. It's when you come to something, if you've experienced something, sometimes you assume things, you know, and if you haven't, then you don't. So how do you actually define skepticism? I'm sorry, I'm just throwing something out there that's just been on my mind the past couple of days of like, like when somebody says skepticism, what do they actually mean? Because it's so subjective.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's good. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that.
Yeah, I don't have an adequate
days.
answer for that one.
have you heard people say that to you before? Like, well, I'm...
From my reading, I've kind of come to the conclusion that skepticism is disbelief until it's reasonably proven to be true. So we've reasonably proven to be true that water hydrates me because I do it every day and I get hydrated. So I'm pretty reasonably sure that it's going to hydrate me, whereas I don't necessarily encounter miracles every day. So I've not necessarily had them reasonably proven to be true to me. So that would be like academic skepticism
how
for
many
me.
would you need to know that it was like...
And
True.
how do you define a miracle?
Yeah.
'Cause a miracle could be a lot of things. It could be the sun coming up.
Yeah.
But it's however you perceive a miracle.
Yeah. But there's also shade on like miracles, because there's this atheist named Darren Brown who literally healed people of chronic illnesses just by a suggestion.
Sure.
So it's kind of like, so there is evidence in like real.
Well, there's a theory behind that too.
Yeah.
Even in
Placebo.
Christian circles that they talk about, but just throw something out there that it's not necessarily philosophy. They call it the law of healing. They suggest that in Scripture, before there was even New Testament healing, there was a law in place before in the Old Testament. And the best way they described it, so it's like, is that healing was always meant to be there. Like, for instance, one law counteracting another law. For instance, you had the law of gravity.
Yeah.
And men never flew until we understood the law of aerodynamics, which trumps the law of gravity. Right?
Yeah.
The moment that Orville and the Wright brothers figured out the law of aerodynamics, that surpassed the law of gravity. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah,
I just think I know I've heard this before.
Yeah.
I've heard this before. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so you're saying maybe he found out something
something
beyond
that was
something
already
that
there.
Yeah, okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's a whole other discussion.
It is.
That's
a really interesting insight there.
Yeah.
You get into the
Yeah.
power of the mind over the physical, and then you have like this mind-body duality almost
Wow, yeah.
that comes into play with suggestive healing.
This is a very long discussion. That's another whole.
That's a whole other
Yeah.
You could say, where is that healing attached to, and multiple sources.
Because you even read like the whole question of like how do you define a miracle? Like there could be, defining it in the classic sense of like, well, it's a cessation of the laws of nature for a moment. Like there's tons of ways. I know a lot of philosophers of religion have suggested ways where God could have ordained from the beginning, like a circumstance where something happened, but it wasn't like necessarily a breaking of the laws. It was from His will. He some of these freak things that happen, or there's something that it doesn't have to necessarily be this one way of looking at it, how a miracle could have occurred.
Well, I think that this is where I'm like jumping off of what you're talking about with like skepticism and the hiddenness, is that the moment we believe something is not hidden, we gain access. It's not that we don't have access before, but somehow I've just been thinking about what you've been saying, and somehow the moment we believe we have access, we may have always had access. Like the prodigal son, he could have always come home. That's clear in the parable because the father was waiting on the front step for him to come home, right? And the father ran the moment he said he was waiting for him. But the moment he believed he had access to come home, then he gained access, even though he always had access, if that makes sense. I don't know.
There's a certain amount of, like, you have the ability to accomplish many things, whether you believe it or not, but you have that capability, and that you're unable to do it until you believe that you can do it. Like, I don't necessarily believe that I could jump over this table, even if I was actually capable of doing it. And then if I was like, you know what, I think I might actually be able to do that, and then I run and jump over it. And
it's interesting, Dr. Rent, you guys know Dr. Rent was at the college, at the university. He's one of the history. He's very, very interesting. He was medieval history, so kind of C.S. Lewis's, not literature, but he talked about this one time, and I would have these interesting discussions with him. He said there was a period of time in Babylonian history where the crops went from producing 3 to 5-fold to suddenly 100, 200-fold. And his response to this, he's written all kinds of books. He's like, how did that happen? How did they suddenly produce 100 and 200 times as much without any kind of like reasonable why? And he came to the conclusion that they just believed it was possible. And I think that this is like, I'm just thinking about the hiddenness of like, when you think he's hidden, he is, because it's almost like you've made a choice. He's hidden. And when you don't think he's hidden, you see him everywhere. But was he ever really hidden?
Well, that's the thing. Like, full disclosure, I did not go to seminary or anything close to it.
I've never been to seminary.
Well, but I keep thinking about this growing up in the church and hearing, like, there can't be reasonable non-belief because God has made himself so visible in nature. And how I grew up hearing that you just can't deny it because of that. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. But once you believe, then you see, like, oh, that's God. He made this stuff. But it is all around you, all around everybody from the very beginning. So I'm having a hard time reconciling that idea.
Like,
yeah.
I'm sorry. You need to be this guy in this discussion.
No, it's really, I love this conversation.
My father-in-law's a missionary, and he's a physician too, so he's a scientist. He talked about this, that like he thought that even in the Gospels you see that Jesus doing miracles, and people still had the right to not believe that he was who he was. The Pharisees, in the midst of thousands and thousands, at one point it says there was 15,000. He said he looked at them and healed them all. They still do not. They had the right. God gave them the choice to not believe in the midst of the snake. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, this is really good. I mean, because I think what you're saying is right, and that it's a really good theme to hit whenever we're talking about hiddenness. I think for me, the reason. So this is actually the reason I'm working on this problem. I think is it's always been a really troubling problem for me, in that because there are so many cases where you're right. Like, I think people are just sort of blinded. They've blinded themselves to the evidence and have almost chosen based on the desires of their heart or whatever to not believe. But and maybe the response is just that these people are self-deluded and they're sinful, and so they just can't really see that they are deceived. But it does seem to me that there are so many people who would really like there to be a God, and it would really, and I think if they really had the evidence to believe, maybe that they would. And again, maybe that's just their self-delusion, or maybe, and so like with I think you're right. Like, there's a lot of evidence, the things that we would see and point to, like, well, what about this and what about this? And I think a lot of times people like that take sort of an agnostic position of like, I don't know, like where we're all here, and I do think it's actually rarer than it probably seems like to us, but I think there are really people who genuinely wrestle with these questions and like literally like cannot come up with an answer. And I think this is all sort of words to them. I don't think anything I've said is going to necessarily change their minds or whatever, but I think only Jesus can do that with the Spirit. But I don't really know what to make of that, because I do think that God loves everybody, and I think God wants to be in a relationship with everybody at every time. I just think that that's true of God, like that he desires to be in a relationship with us. And so these cases, and again, I think they're pretty rare, honestly, but I do think there are some really tough cases that
What do you think about this? Maybe you can answer this. What do you think about the connection between faith and evidence, and what does that actually mean? I mean, because they're looking for evidence, but it's clear that faith is a key. And what are they really looking for? You know, it's like at some point, how do you jump from whatever evidence you have, like in a court case? Like at a certain point, the jury has to have faith in something, unless the person just completely confesses. And at a certain point,
even then, sometimes people falsely confess.
People do falsely confess a lot.
Yeah. So it's kind of beyond that, you're not even sure.
So how do you, the evidence and faith?
There's an element of human control, and that like when you're trying to come to a judgment decision in the courtroom, like there's going to have to be an element of releasing all of it. You know, there's a sense of like, hey, we're going to at some point have to just trust it. You know, like
we have to make a decision.
Yeah.
Well, just to add to that, I feel like a lot of times people who are in those very tough cases, they're not necessarily like weighing evidence. They're more just looking for an absolute. They would rather just God was there. They're not so much. I mean, they are wrestling with evidence, but evidence was never going to tip them. Like for them, it almost seems like it would have to be an absolute. Like God would just have to present Himself.
Just have to like show up.
He would just have to be there openly. No amount of evidence is ever going to tip the scale.
And so I think the response would just be, is that so much to ask? That if there is an all-powerful God who can do anything, and I think what really complicates it more is that there are cases in which God has shown up in some really big ways. So you think of I was going to say some stories of healing or whatever it may be, or I mean the famous example is Paul on the Damascus Road of having this blinding light and saying, "I am Jesus who you're persecuting." Why doesn't God do that for everybody?
I know a number of folks who've had that kind of experience. Internationally.
See you, Robert. Good to see you, dude.
And so I do think that there's something to that. There's something, and I think ultimately it is a question that we don't actually just have all the answers to, and that's okay. I'm not like worried. I'm not worried to that extent, but I do think it's troubling because it does seem like God could do more for people, and I mean we are weak and sinful people, and I mean God's shown the depths to which He'll come to save us, and so. Just showing up in a sort of overt way, I don't think is too much to ask. But
back to your point earlier, it was about evidence in general, and I think there's about like love and just like this kind of notion of freedom at the core that there has to be a choice involved somewhere for love or freedom. I'm going to appeal to some Chesterton. I feel like it's fitting. I think is it chapter? It's in Orthodoxy. It's either it's called the Madman. I think it is.
That's the first
chapter.
Of Madness.
Maniac. I love the end of that chapter because Chesterton basically says like we're all perfectly capable of going around, living in our own little worlds, having the he kind of paints the picture of a circle. Like if your reason is circular, you can make it perfect, you can make it fit, and infinitely your whole system works. But he just kind of says how stupid and sad is that in a universe as big as this, and just living in this tiny little circle of reason that you've constructed yourself. And I said, I think at the center of the human experience, regardless of whatever evidence you presented, even if it's the beatific vision, if you're trying to satisfy that little circle, it's probably not going to happen. You can always come up with a new reason to completely just be skeptical at everything. I think to be able to take the ability for us to take that skeptical posture is so important. It really is. But I think it's kind of the point as well, is when it comes to love, and I actually think this is not so much, this could be a whole other way to go at Schellenberg. But I think this ability of being able to be skeptical is very important. Yeah. It is. Because, that point you raised about Jesus, or like in the miracles when Christ came, and there's, you read about the ears being shut, their eyes were not open. Like, what getting into that, I don't want to go on that. But this idea that people are still rejecting this in something so blatantly bold-faced as Lazarus being raised from the dead. Things like that. And so it's just this innate ability to still deny, duck and weave as much as you want. I think Chesterton's picking up on that. It's like it's important. You can do that.
That right there is something I've struggled with over the past couple of months because I've experienced some folks where sometimes people have seen things and they immediately believe their whole family comes, like Cornelius. I've experienced this in ministry, but then I don't know if we talked about this last time, so can I tell a 30-second story?
Oh, sure, yeah.
the last time I went to Israel, so I go out with like Israeli evangelists and who are pastors and kind of build this kind of like going out in the streets and love and all over and doing things like this. And sometimes we go to a place, and the Lord would direct us and say, go to this place, go to this bench, there'll be a woman who has this condition. We went there, this is all in Hebrew. The woman had a condition, we prayed, she was immediately healed. We prayed over her. She immediately believed. Her entire family came. And then my friend said, I was the other day at the playground and I heard her son witnessing to all the other children. Right? Yeah. And that's happened this time too, but then there's times where I had another similar experience where I was with an Israeli evangelist, and the Lord said, go to this place at the Jordan River, and there'll be these people there, and this is how you'll know. We went there, and a very clear word that there was people there that had neck injuries. And we went to a family, did I tell this story last time? Mm-hmm. There was a family of about 6, an Israeli family, who 4 adult children about your guys' age who'd been through the army already, and 2 older parents. And we just said, hey, we're just praying for people in the name of Jesus, we'd say Yeshua, for them to be healed just as a witness of his goodness. Because a lot of Jews don't even know who Jesus is. They think he's a Norse god. they really do. They think of that. And we said, so does anyone here have any neck injuries? And like half the family raised their hand. Like that, right? We prayed for them. They started getting really immediately healed and touched the son. And these are Israeli soldiers. Started weeping. And everything was amazing, right? And they even said, please come to our house for dinner. You need to come to our house for dinner. That's a typical response. You need to come to our house for dinner. So that was 2016. This time I came back. And I thought, and this is kind of academic. I want to check back and see like how people are doing and evidence that it's nice. So I've kept up with one of the daughters who lives in Netanya, and I said, hey, I just want to ask, there was 3 or 4 of them who had neck injuries. How is your necks? And she's like, from that day we were completely healed, everybody in the family. But yet, I said, well, can I come over sometime? There was no response. Because I wanted to fulfill that, and I recognized I've had this response where people taste the goodness of God, they receive evidence, but they still don't want to believe. Even in the midst of his goodness. That's really troubling. That's like heavy evidence that actually sits on your life, that changes your life for the good. I've had that happen, and people just don't want to. That's where I'm troubled.
Yeah.
Where it's like there's skepticism, but there's also a deliberate, willful act of like, I don't want to go any further than just receiving the fruit of the land rather than receiving the vine keeper. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Just like, so this right here is like something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, it's good.
Like really mulling over. It's troubling.
Yeah.
Well, we could talk about this stuff all night. Really, really quickly before we end, I'll tell you guys my response of my dissertation to Schellenberg. So it was similar to actually what Robert was saying. I think that God would, for a time, allow reasonable non-belief in order to make a long-lasting relationship more likely. And so I don't know if anyone's seen the movie The Terminal with Tom Hanks. Has anyone seen this movie? So this is one of my prime examples. He's stuck in an airplane terminal. He's like, yes, it's great. So in the movie,
tell me why you like it too.
So I like the movie. It's good. It's a good movie because Tom Hanks is amazing. But I think it actually helps respond to Schellenberg in this way that there's a scene, or it's woven throughout the movie, but Tom Hanks' character Victor visits Dolores, who's a police officer, every single day to try to get his form stamped so he can leave. He doesn't really understand what's going on, and they form this fun relationship. Meanwhile, he also forms a relationship with Enrique, who's a food service worker there at the airport. And so he's friends with both of these people, but Enrique loves Dolores. Dolores has no idea that Enrique exists. But Dolores fears that Enrique fears that if he goes up and introduces himself, that Dolores is just going to reject him and it's going to end any possibility he has of getting with her. And so what he does is he chooses to mediate his relationship through Victor, Tom Hanks, and so Tom goes up to Dolores every day and tells her about this mystery man who loves her, and ends up happily ever after and such. But I think that God tends to work through other people. And I think it's something that we see in Scripture pretty often, is that often when God rarely, and you could possibly say if ever, accomplishes things by divine fiat or just in divine power. He's almost always using someone else to accomplish these fantastic ends. Not even, it's not, and working through other people. So actually, this is sort of a name drop, but my professor at St. Andrews is N.T. Wright, and he came up with this phrase that I have latched onto. He said that God is a de-anthropic God, and that the dia, Greek preposition, is through, dia, and so that God tends to work through people in the way that He does things, and I think that's right, and but we're imperfect vessels, obviously. We're imperfect people, and so there's going to be reasonable non-belief, but that God's still working and working through people, and that in a lot of cases this will make people more likely to be in a relationship with Him, that if He's introduced through a mutual friend, let's say. So anyway, that'll be my response. It won't be any of these, but
so
I'll
your
bring
response is actually to negate, to go against.
Schellenberg?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, because his conclusion is there is no God. I believe in God. So, I'm just giving a theological response to Schellenberg. So, yep. So I was just defending Schellenberg in the time because, I feel like I have to usually.